reading the room. The communication skills they don't teach in leadership training. Written and narrated by MSc Boost. You prepared exactly what you wanted to say. You chose your words carefully. You delivered your message with confidence. And somehow, it still landed wrong. This happens to leaders dozens of times each week, and the usual explanation that you weren't clear enough is almost always incorrect. Your team understood your words perfectly. They just interpreted them through a lens you never considered. You walked into a conversation with your message already locked and loaded, unaware that the room you entered would warp everything you said. While you focused on perfecting your delivery, you missed the pre-existing conditions that would determine whether your carefully chosen words motivated people or shut them down. Chapter 1. Why your words keep missing the mark. Most leadership communication training operates on a dangerous assumption that good communication is about what you say and how you say it. This is why leaders can take the same approach that worked brilliantly last Tuesday and watch it completely bomb on Thursday. They blame themselves for poor execution or assume their team is being difficult. The real problem runs deeper. They're treating communication as a message delivery problem when it's actually a diagnostic problem. Here's what actually happened in that failed conversation. Before you even opened your mouth, 3 invisible forces were already at work, priming your team to receive your message in ways you didn't anticipate. The group had a temperature, a collective emotional state ranging from energized to depleted. Power dynamics were operating below the surface, determining whose voice mattered and who felt safe enough to be honest. Everyone present had an emotional baseline that day, shaped by what happened in the hour before you walked in. You entered that room unaware of these conditions. You delivered your message as planned. And those 3 invisible factors immediately went to work, filtering and distorting everything you said. When you announced a new initiative to a depleted team, your enthusiasm read as tone-deaf rather than inspiring. When you asked for honest feedback in a room where power dynamics made disagreement feel dangerous, people gave you fake agreement instead of truth. When you tried to course correct with someone who was already defensive from an earlier interaction, your diplomatic approach sounded patronizing rather than considerate. None of this means you communicated poorly. You just communicated without diagnosis. The difference matters more than most leaders realize. When you focus solely on message delivery, you keep refining what you say and how you say it, hoping that perfecting your approach will finally break through. You try being more direct, then more diplomatic, then more inspirational. Nothing consistently works because you're adjusting the wrong variable. You're treating symptoms instead of causes. Effective leadership communication starts before you speak. It starts with reading what's already present in the room, the energy level, the safety people feel, the unspoken concerns sitting just beneath the surface. This diagnostic skill determines whether your next words will land or bounce off. You can deliver the exact same message in the exact same way to 2 different groups and get completely opposite reactions, depending on what you diagnosed beforehand. Group temperature reflects the collective energy and emotional state of the people in front of you. This isn't about whether individuals are having good days or bad days. Groups develop their own weather systems that transcend individual moods. A team can be cautiously optimistic, actively resistant, exhaustedly compliant, or genuinely energized. These states shift based on recent wins or losses, workload intensity, trust levels, and how safe people feel being honest. When you walk into a meeting, the group already has a temperature. Trying to deliver an energizing message to an exhausted team doesn't pump them up, it makes them resent your disconnect from their reality. Announcing changes to people who are already overwhelmed doesn't inspire adaptation, it triggers resistance. The content of your message matters far less than whether it matches or clashes with the existing temperature. Most leaders sense group temperature intuitively, but ignore what they sense. You walk into a room and immediately feel the heaviness, but you proceed with your planned upbeat message anyway. You notice people seem guarded, but you ask for candid input as if trust is abundant. You can tell energy is low, but you launch into details that require sharp focus. Then you're baffled when your words fall flat. Group temperature isn't an obstacle to work around. It's essential data that should shape how you communicate. When you diagnose low energy correctly, you can adjust leading with acknowledgement instead of inspiration, or keeping your message brief instead of comprehensive. When you notice high tension, you don't pretend it isn't there. You address it before trying to accomplish anything else. Power dynamics determine who feels safe speaking up and whose voice actually influences decisions. These dynamics exist whether you acknowledge them or not, and they powerfully shape how people interpret your words. When you say, "I want honest feedback," your position of authority changes what that statement means. People hear, "I want feedback that won't make me defensive," or "I want you to validate my idea with minor suggestions." They're calculating risk before they calculate honesty. You might believe you've created psychological safety, but power dynamics don't disappear just because you're well-intentioned. People still notice who got promoted and who didn't. They remember which ideas you championed and which ones you dismissed. They track whose interruptions you tolerate and whose you shut down. All of this context surrounds your words before you speak them. When you ask, "Does anyone have concerns?" in a meeting where disagreement has historically been punished, the silence doesn't mean agreement. It means people have correctly diagnosed that voicing concerns is risky. When you pitch a new direction and encourage pushback, people filter their response through, "How did the last person who pushed back get treated?" Your words don't exist in a vacuum. They land in an environment shaped by every previous interaction. Reading power dynamics doesn't mean you need to erase hierarchy or pretend authority doesn't exist. It means you account for how your position shapes message reception. Sometimes you need to explicitly name the power dynamic to diffuse it. Sometimes you need to change your communication mode entirely because certain messages can't land from someone in your position. Sometimes you need to create mechanisms for honest input that bypass the face-to-face dynamic where your presence distorts what people say. Emotional baseline describes the state each person brings into the room before you start talking. Someone who just got blindsided by a budget cut isn't in the same headspace as someone fresh off a major win. These individual starting points matter because they determine receptivity to your message. You can't deliver hard truths to someone who's already raw from criticism. You can't pitch optimism to someone who just experienced a significant disappointment. Leaders often miss emotional baseline because they focus on the current interaction. You enter a one-on-one ready to discuss performance issues, unaware that the person across from you is still processing news of a sick parent. You don't know they barely slept. You can't see they've spent the morning managing a crisis you haven't heard about yet. So you launch into your agenda, and your carefully planned conversation goes sideways because you're speaking to someone who isn't actually available to receive what you're saying. This doesn't mean you need to know everything happening in people's lives. It means you need to check the baseline before you proceed. A simple, "How are you?" asked with genuine curiosity and space for a real answer can reveal whether this is the right moment for your planned message. Sometimes the answer is "not great," and your best communication move is to reschedule or completely change your approach. All three factors, group temperature, power dynamics, and emotional baseline, operate simultaneously. They layer on top of each other, creating the actual conditions where your message lands. You're not just speaking to individuals or groups. You're speaking into specific contexts that are already primed to interpret your words in particular ways. When you ignore these factors and focus only on message clarity, you're essentially shouting into wind you can't see. You think the problem is your volume or your word choice, so you try harder. You speak more emphatically. You add more detail. You find better analogies. None of it works because you're solving for the wrong variable. Being clear is table stakes. Your message does need to make logical sense. But clarity only matters after you've correctly diagnosed what you're walking into. You need to know if the room is ready to hear what you're about to say. You need to understand if your position as the messenger will distort the message. You need to sense whether people have the emotional bandwidth to actually receive your words right now. This diagnostic skill changes everything about how you communicate. Instead of preparing perfect messages, you prepare yourself to read rooms accurately. Instead of practicing delivery, you practice observation. Instead of asking, "How should I say this?" you start asking, "What am I walking into? And what does that context require?" Before any important conversation, you can run a quick checkpoint that addresses all three factors. You ask yourself, what's the temperature here? What power dynamics are present that might distort my message? What baseline are people bringing to this conversation? These three questions shift you from message-focused communication to context-aware communication. The temperature question forces you to actually notice what you're sensing. You stop overriding your intuition about heaviness, resistance, or exhaustion in the room. You let that data inform how you proceed instead of pushing through with your planned approach. The power dynamics question makes you consider how your position colors everything you say. You stop assuming your good intentions override structural realities. You start accounting for how authority changes message interpretation. The baseline question prevents you from steamrolling over what people are actually experiencing. You check whether this is the right moment before you launch into your agenda. You create space for reality before you try to change it. This checkpoint takes maybe 30 seconds. But those 30 seconds change whether your next words land or miss. They change whether your team hears what you meant or something entirely different. They change whether your communication creates clarity or confusion. Most leaders skip this diagnostic step because they're focused on what they need to say. They have information to deliver, decisions to announce, or problems to solve. The urgency of the message overrides the wisdom of diagnosing first. They walk into conversations hot, ready to communicate, without first understanding what they're communicating into. The results are predictable. Messages delivered to the wrong temperature fall flat. Messages that ignore power dynamics get fake agreement. Messages that miss emotional baseline create resentment or shutdown. Then leaders wonder why their teams seem checked out, why decisions don't stick, why the same issues keep resurfacing. Your words don't exist separately from context. They land in real conditions with real people who are interpreting everything through multiple filters. When you treat communication as pure message delivery, you're ignoring the most powerful forces shaping whether your message actually gets through. This doesn't mean you need to become a mind reader or delay every conversation until conditions are perfect. It means you develop the skill of reading what's present before you speak. You learn to diagnose accurately so you can adjust intelligently. You stop expecting the same approach to work every time and start matching your communication to actual conditions. The good news is that diagnostic reading is a learnable skill. You already do it intuitively in some situations. When you walk into your home and immediately sense tension, you adjust your approach. When you meet a friend for coffee and notice they're off, you shift gears. You're already reading temperature, dynamics, and baseline in personal contexts. The challenge is bringing that same diagnostic awareness into your leadership communication. What follows in this book is a framework for sharpening that diagnostic skill. You'll learn exactly what to observe, how to interpret what you're seeing, and how to adjust your communication based on accurate diagnosis. You'll develop the ability to read energy before words, choose communication modes in real time, spot disagreement before it's spoken, handle silence effectively, and adjust your message while you're still talking. But all of those skills build on this foundation. Context determines everything. Your message matters, but the conditions where it lands matter more. Communication effectiveness starts with accurate diagnosis, not better delivery. When you learn to read the room first, your words finally start landing the way you intend them to. Chapter 2. Reading energy before you read words. Your team member says, "I'm fine with the new approach," but their shoulders have pulled up toward their ears and their breathing just got shallow. Someone nods along during your explanation, while their eyes track to the door every 15 seconds. A colleague leans back and crosses their arms the moment you mention budget constraints, well before you've explained the actual numbers. These physical signals are data. They're telling you what's happening beneath the surface, often contradicting the words being spoken. Most leaders notice these cues peripherally, but dismiss them, choosing to take verbal responses at face value. This is a mistake. The body reveals truth that language conceals. When you learn to read physical signals with the same attention you give to spoken words, you gain access to the real conversation happening in every interaction. The human nervous system responds to perceived threat or safety within milliseconds, long before conscious thought kicks in. When someone feels uncertain, defensive, or unsafe, their body broadcasts this state through muscle tension, breathing patterns, and spatial positioning. These aren't deliberate choices. They're autonomic responses that happen too quickly for people to control or mask effectively. You can hear confidence or hesitation in vocal tone before parsing the actual words. You can see resistance in how someone positions their body relative to you. You can detect mental checkout through subtle eye movement patterns. All of this information exists in every conversation, available to anyone who knows what to look for and trusts what they observe. The challenge is that most people override their observations. You notice someone's face flush and their jaw tighten when you mention a deadline, but you continue explaining the timeline as if nothing happened. You register that the room has gone physically still when you announced a policy change, but you push forward with implementation details. You catch someone's eyes glazing over mid-sentence, but you finish your full explanation anyway. This override happens because verbal content feels more reliable than physical observation. Words are explicit. Body language feels interpretive, subjective, easy to misread. So leaders default to trusting what people say while ignoring what their bodies reveal. They wait for verbal objections while missing the physical signals of resistance happening right in front of them. Learning to read energy means reversing this hierarchy. Physical signals become your primary data source. Words become secondary confirmation or contradiction of what the body already told you. This shift feels uncomfortable because it requires trusting your observations, even when they conflict with verbal assurances. But physical signals are harder to fake than language, which makes them more reliable indicators of what's actually happening. Body positioning tells you about engagement, defensiveness, and power dynamics before anyone speaks. When people lean forward slightly, they're engaged and receptive. When they lean back, they're either thinking critically or creating psychological distance. When they angle their torso away from you, while keeping their head facing forward, they're physically and mentally checking out while maintaining the appearance of attention. Watch what happens when you walk into a room. People who feel safe and engaged will orient their bodies toward you. People who are wary will keep their torsos angled away, even if they turn their heads to make eye contact. This torso orientation is involuntary. Someone might smile and greet you warmly while their body stays turned toward their computer or angled toward the door. Arms crossed over the chest gets oversimplified as defensive body language, but context matters. Someone might cross their arms because they're cold, or because it's their default comfortable position. The signal to watch for is the change. When someone's arms are relaxed at their sides and then suddenly cross during a specific part of your conversation, you've hit something that triggered a protective response. They just created a physical barrier between themselves and what you're saying. Leg positioning reveals similar information. When someone sits with legs uncrossed and feet planted on the floor, they're grounded and present. When they cross their legs away from you, they're creating distance. When they tuck their feet under their chair or wrap their ankles around the chair legs, they're literally anchoring themselves, often because they feel uncertain or defensive. Watch for physical stillness as a signal of discomfort or disagreement. When you say something that lands well, people tend to have natural micro-movements, small shifts in position, slight nods, relaxed gestures. When you say something that creates tension or disagreement, people often freeze. This sudden stillness happens because the nervous system is processing a threat and preparing a response. The room doesn't just feel different. It literally moves differently. Eye contact patterns reveal attention, confidence, and truthfulness. Someone who maintains steady eye contact while speaking is typically confident in what they're saying. Someone whose eyes dart away repeatedly might be uncertain, uncomfortable, or withholding information. But you need to know someone's baseline to interpret deviations accurately. Some people naturally make less eye contact. The signal is the change from their normal pattern. When you're speaking, and someone's eyes glaze over or unfocus, they've mentally left the conversation. They might still be looking at you, but their gaze has gone soft. This is different from active listening, where eyes stay focused and track with your words. The glazed look means they're no longer processing what you're saying. They're either thinking about something else or have given up trying to follow you. Watch where eyes go during pauses. When you ask a question and someone's eyes immediately drop down, they're likely feeling uncertain or defensive about their answer. When eyes go up and to the side, they're accessing memory or thinking through their response. When eyes dart to other people in the room before answering, they're checking for social cues about what's safe to say. The frequency of blinking increases under stress. Someone who normally blinks 12 times per minute might suddenly blink 20 or 30 times when you raise a sensitive topic. This isn't a conscious choice. The nervous system responds to stress by increasing blink rate. When you notice this spike, you've touched something that created internal tension. Eyes tracking to the door or clock repeatedly signal that someone wants to leave the conversation. They might be late for something, or they might be looking for escape from discomfort. Either way, they're not fully present. Continuing to talk as if you have their full attention when their eyes keep seeking exit routes wastes both your time and theirs. Breathing changes are among the most reliable indicators of emotional shifts. Stress and defensiveness trigger shallow chest breathing. Safety and engagement allow for deeper belly breathing. You can see this change happen in real time if you know where to look. Watch the shoulders and upper chest. When someone feels safe and open, their breathing is low and slow. You'll see gentle movement in the belly area with minimal shoulder movement. When they shift into stress or defense, breathing moves up into the chest and becomes more rapid. The shoulders start rising and falling with each breath. This shift can happen mid-sentence when you say something that triggers a threat response. Held breath is a clear signal of tension or resistance. Someone takes a breath to speak. You interrupt or say something unexpected, and they hold that breath instead of releasing it. They might look like they're about to say something but don't. That held breath is a physical manifestation of swallowed words or suppressed reactions. Sighing reveals frustration or resignation. A single deep exhale that's louder than normal breathing patterns tells you someone is releasing tension. If this happens when you explain a decision or outline next tasks, they're signaling disagreement or demoralization without verbalizing it. The sigh is their body's way of releasing the objection they're not speaking aloud. Breathing that syncs between people indicates rapport and agreement. When two people are genuinely aligned, their breathing patterns often match without conscious effort. When you're speaking to a group and notice several people breathing at similar rates and depths, you've got alignment. When you see sharp contrasts in breathing patterns, some people slow and deep, others rapid and shallow, you've got division in the room. Vocal tone carries more information than the words being spoken. Pitch, pace, volume, and inflection reveal confidence, certainty, and emotional state. Someone can say, "I agree" in 10 different ways, and each variation tells you something completely different about whether they actually agree. Rising intonation at the end of statements turns them into questions. "I think this could work" sounds like agreement on the surface, but the upward inflection reveals uncertainty. The speaker isn't making a statement. They're seeking validation or expressing doubt. Pace changes mid-sentence signal discomfort with the content. When someone starts a sentence at their normal speaking pace and then speeds up or slows down dramatically, They've hit something that changed their internal state. Speeding up often indicates nervousness or a desire to get past uncomfortable information quickly. Slowing down can signal careful word choice, either because they're being cautious or because they're not being fully honest. Volume drops when people lack conviction. Someone might verbally agree with your plan, but if their voice gets quieter when they say yes, they're not actually on board. The diminishing volume reveals their waning commitment to the words they're speaking. Vocal fry or breathiness creeps in under stress. When someone's voice gets scratchy or loses its clear tone, their vocal cords are tensing. This physical tension reflects mental or emotional tension about what they're saying or hearing. You don't need to name it. You just need to register that something shifted. Listen for hedging language paired with uncertain vocal tone. Maybe we could possibly consider. Isn't just cautious word choice. When combined with tentative vocal delivery, it signals someone who desperately wants to disagree, but doesn't feel safe being direct. The words are trying to soften. The voice is revealing the effort. Throat clearing before speaking indicates nervousness or the need to prepare to say something difficult. The physical act of clearing the throat is the body's way of preparing the voice for speech that feels risky or uncomfortable. When someone clears their throat multiple times before answering your question, whatever they're about to say is costing them something to speak aloud. Silence itself has texture and meaning. Dead silence feels different from thoughtful silence. Resistant silence feels different from confused silence. You can learn to distinguish these types through the physical signatures that accompany them. Thoughtful silence comes with visible processing. People might look up or away, but you can see their minds working. Their face stays engaged. They might nod slightly or show micro-expressions while thinking. This silence is productive. Breaking it prematurely interrupts useful cognitive work. Resistant silence feels heavy and still. People's faces go neutral or slightly harden. Bodies pull back or close off. Eyes might stay on you, but without warmth or engagement. This silence is a refusal to engage. Waiting it out won't produce honest conversation. You need to address the resistance directly. Confused silence shows up as furrowed brows, head tilts, or quick glances between people trying to see if others understand. This silence needs clarification, not more time. People aren't withholding responses. They genuinely don't know what to say because they didn't follow your explanation. Uncomfortable silence involves visible physical tension. People shift in their seats, clear throats, look at the table or their hands. They want someone to break the silence, but don't want to be the one who does it. This often happens after you've said something that created tension no one wants to address. The gap between words and physical signals reveals where truth lies. When someone says, "I'm excited about this direction," while their body language shows every sign of stress and resistance, believe the body. When someone verbally assures you they understand while their face broadcasts confusion, believe the confusion. Physical signals leak truth that verbal control tries to contain. You can practice reading these signals anywhere. Meetings provide rich observation opportunities, but so do casual conversations, presentations you attend, and interactions you witness as a third party. Start noticing what bodies are doing while voices are speaking. Track the consistency or gaps between physical signals and verbal content. Watch yourself in the mirror while having difficult conversations on the phone. You can't see the other person, but you can see your own physical responses. Notice what your body does when you feel defensive, uncertain, or skeptical. This builds awareness of signals you're broadcasting that others can see. Record yourself in meetings and watch with the sound off. You'll notice physical patterns you're completely unaware of during live interactions. You might see that you close off physically when certain topics arise, or that your face shows skepticism before you've consciously registered disagreement. Observe conversations in public spaces. Coffee shops, restaurants, and airports offer chances to watch human interaction without being a participant. See if you can read the energy of conversations happening nearby based purely on physical signals. Are they having conflict? Is someone delivering bad news? Are they genuinely enjoying each other? Check your read against what you later observe as the conversation continues. Practice noticing in low-stakes situations before relying on this skill in high-stakes ones. Chat with a barista and notice their body language. Talk with a neighbor and track their physical signals. The more you practice reading energy outside of work, the more automatic this skill becomes when you need it during important leadership conversations. Calibrate your observations by checking them. When you read tension in someone's body language, you can name what you're noticing. I'm getting the sense this doesn't sit well with you. Am I reading that right? This gives them the chance to confirm or correct your interpretation. Over time, you'll learn which signals you read accurately and which ones you misinterpret. Watch for clusters of signals rather than relying on single cues. Crossed arms alone might mean nothing. Crossed arms plus shallow breathing plus eyes tracking to the door plus vocal tension creates a clear pattern. The more signals pointing to the same conclusion, the more reliable your read. Some people are physically expressive. Others keep tight control of their bodies. Knowing someone's baseline helps you spot meaningful deviations. The naturally animated person going physically still is significant. The normally controlled person making larger gestures than usual is equally meaningful. You're not looking for specific positions or expressions. You're looking for changes from what's normal for that individual. Physical signals happen faster than conscious thought. When you ask a question, and someone's face flashes micro-expressions before settling into a neutral or positive expression, that flash is the truth. The settled expression is the managed response. Train yourself to catch those first reactions before people gain conscious control. Groups develop collective physical patterns. When you're presenting to a team and notice everyone's body language shifting in the same direction, leaning back, crossing arms, breathing more shallowly, you've got group-level resistance. This is different from one dissenting voice. This is collective disagreement that no one is verbalizing yet. The absence of physical tension can be as meaningful as its presence. When you deliver potentially difficult news and people stay physically open and relaxed, you're seeing genuine acceptance or resilience. When you pitch an ambitious goal and people lean forward with engaged body language and smooth breathing, you've got authentic buy-in. Reading energy isn't about catching people in lies or proving they're not being honest. It's about accessing more complete information so you can communicate more effectively. When you notice someone's body signaling resistance while their words agree, you're not judging them. You're getting data that tells you to slow down and create space for the honest objection to emerge. Physical signals show you what's happening before people have words for it. Someone might not consciously realize they're uncomfortable with your proposal. Their body knows before their mind catches up. When you learn to read that physical discomfort, you can address it before it hardens into active resistance. This skill changes how you enter conversations. Instead of launching into your planned message, you take 30 seconds to observe. What's the physical state of the person or group in front of you? Are bodies open or closed? Is breathing relaxed or stressed? Are eyes engaged or scanning for escape? This quick scan tells you whether the room is ready to receive what you came to say, or whether you need to adjust your approach before you've spoken a word. Reading energy doesn't replace verbal communication. It enhances it. You still need to talk, explain, and persuade. But now you're doing it with accurate information about receptivity, resistance, and readiness. You're not speaking into a void. You're speaking to specific physical and emotional states that you've correctly identified. Physical signals give you permission to change course mid-conversation. When you notice bodies closing off during your explanation, you don't push through to the end. You pause and address what you're observing. When you see confusion written on faces, you stop adding information and start clarifying what you've already said. The body language becomes your guide for how to proceed. Learning this skill transforms every interaction. You stop taking verbal responses at face value and start trusting the more reliable information written on bodies and heard in voices. You make fewer assumptions about alignment and catch resistance earlier. You waste less time explaining things to people whose physical signals are screaming that they've already checked out. Your communication becomes more efficient because you're working with accurate data about what's actually happening in front of you. Chapter 3. Choosing your communication mode in real time. You've read the room correctly. You can see the physical tension, sense the group temperature, and recognize the power dynamics at play. Now you need to decide how to actually communicate. This is where most leaders default to their comfortable mode regardless of context. Some leaders always go direct. Others perpetually ask questions. Still others stay diplomatic, even when the situation demands bluntness. The problem isn't that these modes are wrong. The problem is using the same mode for every situation. Direct communication that works brilliantly when announcing a clear decision creates defensiveness when exploring a complex problem. Questions that surface useful insights during brainstorming waste precious time during a crisis. Diplomatic language that preserves relationships when navigating politics comes across as manipulative when people need straight answers. You need 3 distinct communication modes and the judgment to know which one the moment requires. Direct mode delivers information and decisions with clarity and minimal cushioning. Exploratory mode uses questions to uncover information and engage thinking. Diplomatic mode wraps hard truths in language that preserves dignity and relationships. Each mode serves specific purposes. Each mode fails catastrophically when misapplied. Direct mode works when you have clarity, authority, and timing on your side. The decision is made. People need to know what's happening and what it means for them. The group is ready to receive clear information without needing extensive processing time. Power dynamics support you being definitive rather than collaborative. This is the mode for announcing organizational changes, delivering decisions that aren't up for debate, and providing explicit direction when confusion is causing problems. Direct mode cuts through ambiguity. It tells people exactly where things stand without making them guess or read between lines. The language of direct mode is declarative and specific. We're moving the deadline to next Friday. Not, I'm thinking we might need to consider adjusting the timeline. Direct mode uses short sentences, active voice, concrete nouns and verbs. It avoids qualifiers like maybe, possibly, or we might want to think about. When you're in direct mode, you lead with the conclusion. You don't build up to your point or provide extensive context before stating what's happening. You say what people need to know first, then provide supporting information. The project is canceled. Here's why that decision was made and what happens next. The conclusion comes first because people in direct mode can't focus on your reasoning until they know the outcome. Your tone stays neutral and matter-of-fact. Direct mode isn't aggressive or harsh. It's simply clear. You're not apologizing for having clarity. You're not softening your message with excessive politeness. You state what's true and what's decided with the same straightforward energy you'd use to describe objective facts. Direct mode requires you to own your authority. This is the direction we're taking carries weight because you're speaking from a position to make that call. When you use direct mode without actual authority to back it up, you sound presumptuous. When you have authority but speak tentatively, you create unnecessary confusion. The body language of direct mode matches the verbal clarity. You maintain steady eye contact. Your posture stays upright and grounded. Your gestures are economical rather than excessive. You're not performing confidence. You're simply inhabiting the certainty of what you're communicating. Direct mode fails when the situation requires input rather than information. You can't use direct mode to explore options, build consensus, or invite dissent. Trying to be direct when people need to be heard first comes across as autocratic. They'll comply with your clear direction while resenting that you never asked for their perspective. Direct mode also fails when emotional processing is needed before people can receive information. You might have perfect clarity about a difficult decision, but if the team isn't ready to hear it, your directness will land as insensitivity. They need acknowledgement of impact before they can absorb the decision itself. Watch for the moment when direct mode starts creating resistance rather than clarity. If you're being clear and people's body language shows increasing tension, you've misread the room. They didn't need more information. They needed a different mode entirely. Exploratory mode uses questions to engage thinking, uncover information, and invite participation. This is the mode for situations where you don't have all the answers, where multiple perspectives will improve the outcome, or where people need to discover solutions themselves, rather than being told what to do. Questions in exploratory mode are genuinely open. You're actually curious about the answers. You're not asking leading questions designed to steer people toward the conclusion you've already reached. What options do we have here? Is exploratory. Don't you think we should do X? Is direct mode disguised as a question. The best exploratory questions create space for honest thinking. What concerns you most about this approach? Invites real objections. What would need to be true for this to work? Shifts thinking from problems to conditions for success. What am I missing? Signals genuine openness to information you don't have. Exploratory mode requires patience. You ask a question and then wait. You don't fill the silence with more talking. You don't answer your own question when the pause gets uncomfortable. You create space and then protect that space so thinking can happen. Your questions get more specific as the exploration deepens. You start broad to open up thinking, then narrow to examine details. What's your take on the current situation? Opens the conversation. What specifically makes you think the timeline is unrealistic? Drills into a concern that emerged. If you had to choose between X and Y, which gets us closer to the outcome we need? Forces priority decisions. Exploratory mode works when power dynamics support honest answering. If you're the authority figure and you ask, "What do you really think?" people filter their responses based on what feels safe to say. You need to actively create conditions where honest exploration feels less risky than performing agreement. This means explicitly giving permission for disagreement. "I need you to poke holes in this plan," tells people you want critical thinking, not validation. "Tell me what worries you about this direction," invites concerns rather than punishing them. "What would you do differently?" Positions them as experts whose judgment matters. You can also shift power temporarily through your own vulnerability. "I'm genuinely stuck on this. Help me think it through," changes the dynamic from authority seeking input to peer exploring together. "What am I not seeing?" Admits your own limits and invites expertise. Exploratory mode body language shows openness and curiosity. You lean in slightly when people talk. You nod to encourage continued sharing. Your face stays engaged and interested rather than neutral or skeptical. You might take notes to signal that what people say matters enough to capture. The danger of exploratory mode is using it when people need direction, not discussion. When a crisis requires immediate action, asking, "What do you all think we should do?" wastes time and creates anxiety. When you've already made a decision, asking questions to fake collaboration breeds cynicism. People can tell when questions are performative rather than genuine. Exploratory mode also fails when people lack the context to contribute meaningfully. Asking, "What should our strategy be?" when people don't understand the constraints you're working within produces unusable answers. You need to provide enough framing that exploration can be productive. Watch for signs that exploratory mode is frustrating people rather than engaging them. If you're asking questions and getting short, terse answers, they don't want to explore. They want you to make a call. If body language shows impatience or resignation, your questions feel like avoidance rather than genuine curiosity. Diplomatic mode wraps necessary truths in language that preserves dignity and relationships. This is the mode for delivering criticism, addressing sensitive topics, or navigating political dynamics where bluntness would create problems you can't afford. Diplomatic language acknowledges impact before stating hard truth. I know you put significant effort into this proposal proceeds, and there are some fundamental issues we need to address. The acknowledgement isn't fake politeness. It's recognition that criticism lands better when effort is seen first. Diplomatic mode uses we and us language to create partnership, even when delivering unilateral decisions. We need to adjust our approach here sounds collaborative, even when you're really saying, you need to change what you're doing. The shift from you to we softens the message without diluting its clarity. Framing challenges as shared problems makes them easier to hear. We're facing a situation where the current timeline isn't going to work beats, you missed the deadline. Both statements address the same issue, but the diplomatic version focuses on the problem rather than blame. Diplomatic mode chooses words that minimize face threat. This isn't quite landing the way we need it to delivers the same message as this is wrong with less defensiveness. I'm concerned about the approach here prompts correction without explicit criticism. Let's think about how we might strengthen this section, provides direction, while framing it as collaborative problem solving. The tone of diplomatic mode stays warm, even when the content is hard. Your voice maintains empathy. Your face shows care rather than judgment. You're delivering difficult information, but you're doing it as someone who wants the person to succeed, not as someone who wants to prove them wrong. Diplomatic mode slows down. You don't rush through the hard part. You pause to let difficult information land. You check for understanding and emotional response. How does that sit with you? Create space for processing. What questions do you have? Invites clarification before moving forward. Diplomatic communication acknowledges emotion without getting derailed by it. When someone gets defensive or upset, you can name what you're seeing without backing down from your message. I can see this is frustrating to hear, validates their reaction. And we still need to address the issue, maintains your purpose. You're not avoiding conflict. You're managing it without escalating it. The body language of diplomatic mode shows care and concern. Your face stays soft rather than hard. Your gestures are open rather than closed. You might lean forward slightly to show engagement. You maintain eye contact, but soften it so it feels compassionate rather than confrontational. Diplomatic mode fails when people need directness more than cushioning. Sometimes wrapping truth in diplomatic language makes it so soft that people miss the actual message. They hear the nice framing and think everything is fine. They don't register the serious problem buried in polite words. Diplomatic mode also backfires when people interpret it as manipulation. If you're being diplomatic because you're afraid of their reaction rather than genuinely caring about their dignity, they'll sense the insincerity. Diplomatic language works when it comes from authentic concern. It fails when it's just a technique to avoid discomfort. Watch for people responding to your diplomacy with increased confusion or false confidence. If you're trying to deliver corrective information diplomatically, and they seem to think you just gave them positive affirmation, your diplomacy obscured your message. You need to shift modes and be more direct. Choosing the right mode starts with your diagnostic read from Chapter 2. What did you observe about the room's temperature, power dynamics, and emotional baseline? That information points you toward the mode most likely to work. High energy and engagement call for direct mode. When people are alert, focused, and ready to receive information, give it to them straight. They don't need questions or excessive cushioning. They need clarity. Uncertainty or confusion calls for exploratory mode. When people seem stuck or unclear, questions help more than statements. You're not withholding answers to be coy. You're creating space for them to think through what they actually need to understand. Defensiveness or vulnerability calls for diplomatic mode. When people are already raw, direct communication feels like an attack. When stakes are high and emotions are elevated, Diplomatic framing makes hard truths receivable. Power imbalances affect mode choice. When you have significantly more authority than the people you're addressing, direct mode can work well. You have the standing to be definitive. When power is relatively equal, or when you're speaking to people with more authority than you, diplomatic mode often serves you better. The relationship you have with specific people shapes which mode they'll receive well. Someone you have strong trust with can handle more directness. Someone you're still building credibility with might need more diplomatic framing. Someone who values being heard wants exploratory engagement. You can start in the mode that seems right based on your read, and then switch if you notice it's not working. This flexibility matters more than choosing perfectly the first time. If you start direct and see bodies closing off, you can shift. Let me back up and hear your take on this first. Moves you from direct to exploratory. I'm laying this out pretty bluntly. How is this landing for you? Shifts toward diplomatic acknowledgement. If you start exploratory and people seem frustrated or impatient, you can shift to direct. Let me stop asking questions and just tell you what I think we need to do here. Gives them the clarity they're craving. If you start diplomatic and realize you're being too soft, you can course correct. I'm trying to be thoughtful about how I say this, but let me be more direct signals the shift. Then you state the hard truth plainly. Some situations need multiple modes in sequence. You might start diplomatic to acknowledge difficulty, shift to exploratory to gather input, and end with direct clarity about the decision. I know this change is going to be hard diplomatic. What concerns you most about it? Exploratory. Here's exactly what's happening and when direct. The trap many leaders fall into is mixing modes within the same message. They start direct, then chicken out and add qualifiers that make the message mushy. We're changing the approach. Maybe, if that seems like it might work for everyone, pick your mode and commit to it. Mixed messages create confusion. Different topics within the same conversation might need different modes. You can be direct about the decision, exploratory about implementation, and diplomatic about the impact on specific people. The shift between modes needs to be clean so people can follow your intent. Brutal honesty has its place, but it's rarer than most direct communicators think. True situations requiring brutal honesty involve immediate danger, ethical violations, or patterns that have persisted despite multiple diplomatic attempts. Most of what feels like situations requiring brutal honesty are actually situations where direct mode is appropriate, but cruelty is not. Direct mode can be kind. This work doesn't meet the standard we need, is direct without being brutal. This is terrible, and you should know better is brutal. The difference matters. Direct mode serves the person by giving them clear information. Brutal honesty often serves the speaker's frustration more than the listener's growth. When people say they value brutal honesty, what they usually mean is they value directness without excessive cushioning. They don't actually want to be brutalized. They want clarity delivered with respect. Questions waste time when the asker already knows the answer and is using questions to avoid owning their position. Don't you think we should try a different approach? Is less efficient than, I think we need to try a different approach. The question makes people guess what you're really saying. Questions also waste time during crises when people need direction more than they need to process. What do you think we should do about this fire? Is less helpful than, here's what we're doing right now. There's a time for collaborative exploration and a time for decisive direction. Questions work when you genuinely don't know the answer and need others' expertise. Questions work when the processing that happens through answering creates better outcomes than just being told what to do. Questions waste time when they're performative, or when they delay action that needs to happen immediately. Diplomatic communication becomes manipulative when it prioritizes comfort over truth. If you're so focused on not upsetting someone that you fail to communicate the actual problem, you've crossed from diplomatic into dishonest. Diplomatic mode should make hard truths easier to receive, not hide them entirely. Diplomacy becomes manipulation when it's used to avoid accountability. Mistakes were made is diplomatic language that obscures who made them. I made a mistake is direct accountability delivered without blame shifting. Diplomatic mode should soften delivery, not obscure responsibility. Diplomacy feels manipulative when the gap between your words and your intent is too large. If you're thinking, this person is completely incompetent, while saying, there's some room for growth here, the mismatch leaks through your tone and body language. People sense the disconnect even if they can't name it. The goal isn't to become equally skilled at all three modes. Most leaders have a natural home mode that feels most comfortable. The goal is to expand your range enough that you can shift when the situation demands it. You might default to exploratory questions, but develop enough direct mode capability to use it when people need clear answers. You might be naturally diplomatic, but build enough comfort with directness to use it when cushioning would obscure necessary truth. Choosing mode in real time is a skill that improves with practice and reflection. After important conversations, review what mode you used and whether it served the situation. Did your directness create clarity or defensiveness? Did your questions engage thinking or frustrate people? Did your diplomacy preserve the relationship or obscure your message? This reflection builds pattern recognition that helps you choose more accurately next time. Your communication becomes dramatically more effective when mode matches context. The same core message lands completely differently depending on how you deliver it. Mode choice turns adequate communication into communication that actually changes behavior, builds understanding, and moves situations forward. Reading the room tells you what's happening. Choosing the right mode tells you how to respond to what you've observed. Chapter 4. Spotting disagreement before it's spoken. Your team member says, "Yeah, that could work," while their face tells you they think it absolutely won't. Someone responds to your proposed timeline with, "I'll do my best," when what they mean is, "This is impossible." A colleague nods through your entire explanation and then does nothing you suggested. Silent disagreement is everywhere. People object to plans, doubt proposed approaches, and see fatal flaws in strategies without ever stating their concerns directly. They've learned that voicing disagreement carries risk, social awkwardness, damaged relationships, potential career consequences. So they've developed sophisticated ways to signal their objections without actually speaking them aloud. Leaders who can't read these signals operate in a fog of false agreement. They think everyone is on board when half the room has already mentally checked out. They mistake polite compliance for genuine commitment. They're blindsided when initiatives fail because they never knew people had serious reservations from the start. The signals are there. You just need to know what to listen for and what to watch for. Disagreement leaks through language patterns, vocal qualities, and physical behaviors, even when people are trying to hide it. Someone might successfully stop themselves from saying, "I think this is a terrible idea," but they can't completely suppress the hedging, the hesitation, and the subtle withdrawal that reveals their true position. Hedging language is the most common verbal signal of unexpressed disagreement. People add qualifiers and softeners to their statements, creating enough ambiguity that they can later claim they warned you without having actually objected directly. "I think maybe we could potentially consider looking at some alternatives" sounds like thoughtful deliberation. It's actually hedged disagreement. The word "maybe" turns a statement into a non-commitment. "Maybe that timeline works" means it probably doesn't. "Maybe we should try that approach" means they doubt it will succeed. "Maybe" creates plausible deniability. The speaker can later say they expressed reservations without having to own a clear objection in the moment. Possibly and potentially serve the same function. "This could possibly create some challenges" is a heavily cushioned way of saying this won't work. "We could potentially run into issues" means they already see the problems clearly, but don't want to state them directly. "I think" and "I feel like" distance the speaker from their own position. "I think this might be challenging" sounds tentative when what they mean is, This is definitely going to be a problem. The phrase, "I think," signals that they're not confident enough in their standing to state their position directly. They're offering it as personal opinion that can be easily dismissed, rather than as serious concern that should be addressed. Listen for excessive qualification before someone states their actual point. "I don't know if this is helpful, but I was just thinking that maybe we might want to consider." Comes before an objection they're afraid to voice clearly. The person is pre-apologizing for disagreeing. All those qualifiers are protective cushioning around what they're about to say. "Just" is a minimizing word that makes concerns sound smaller than they are. "I just wanted to mention that the timeline seems tight," downplays what's likely a serious worry about feasibility. "I'm just wondering if we've thought through all the implications," is a gentle way of saying, "I don't think we've planned this well enough." Conditional language frames disagreement as hypothetical. "If we did go this direction, we might encounter some obstacles," means they already see those obstacles clearly. "Assuming we move forward with this, I'm not sure how we'd handle X," is indirect pushback against moving forward at all. To be honest, or honestly, before a statement signals that what follows contradicts what they think you want to hear. "Honestly, I'm not sure about this approach," means they're pretty sure it won't work. The phrase, "to be honest," shouldn't be necessary if someone is normally honest. Its presence indicates they're about to say something they believe involves social risk. Phrases that defer to others' judgment, while undermining the idea, do double duty. "I mean, if everyone else thinks it's good, then sure," is passive resistance disguised as agreement. Whatever you think is best sounds compliant, while actually signaling withdrawal of their own judgment and investment. Questions posed as gentle inquiry are often disagreement in disguise. "Have we considered how this might affect the timeline?" isn't a neutral question seeking information. It's a concern about timeline impact that the speaker doesn't want to state directly. "Do we have the resources for this?" really means, "I don't think we have the resources for this. I'm just curious." Before a question signals that what follows is actually a concern. "I'm just curious how we'll handle the implementation," means they see implementation as a serious problem. The "just curious" framing attempts to make their doubt sound like neutral interest rather than substantive objection. Watch how people respond when you propose something. Immediate, clear agreement sounds different from hedged pseudo-agreement. "Yes, that works," is commitment. "Yeah, I mean, we can try that," is hedged doubt. "I guess we could give it a shot," is resistance barely disguised as willingness. Delayed responses to direct questions reveal internal conflict. You ask, "Does this timeline work for you?" And there's a noticeable pause before, "Sure, that should be fine." The pause is them talking themselves into agreeing when their gut says no. Genuine agreement comes quickly. Forced agreement requires processing time, while they override their real response. Tone shifts during agreement reveal insincerity. Someone says, "That sounds great," but their voice is flat or drops at the end of the sentence. Verbal agreement without vocal enthusiasm indicates compliance rather than commitment. The words say yes. The tone says no. Volume decreases when people agree to things they don't actually agree with. Their voice gets quieter, as if they're hoping their agreement won't be noticed or remembered. Confident agreement maintains or increases volume. Reluctant agreement fades. Passive resistance shows up in what people don't do after appearing to agree. They don't ask follow-up questions about implementation. They don't volunteer for next tasks. They don't build on your idea with their own suggestions. Genuine buy-in generates momentum. Passive resistance creates stillness. Someone who truly agrees will typically engage with the details. When you say "we're moving the deadline," does that affect the deliverables too? Shows someone thinking through implications because they're actually planning to implement. Someone who passively resists will go quiet and wait for the conversation to end. Watch for the shift from active participation to silent observation. Someone who was engaged earlier in the meeting suddenly stops talking when you propose a specific direction. This withdrawal is information. They disagreed strongly enough to disengage, but not strongly enough to voice objection. Compliance without commitment sounds like agreement, but lacks the markers of genuine buy-in. The person says they'll do what you asked. They might even start doing it. But there's no ownership, no problem-solving energy, no adaptation when obstacles arise. They're going through motions without believing in the purpose. "I'll try" is the classic compliance without commitment phrase. "I'll try to meet that deadline" means they've already decided they won't meet it. "I'll try to make that work" signals they expect it won't work. Try builds in plausible failure from the start. People who are genuinely committed don't position themselves for failure. They commit, or they explain why they can't. "I'll do my best" functions similarly when said without conviction. The phrase should signal effort and determination. But when delivered with flat affect or resignation in the voice, it means, "I don't think this is achievable, but I'll go through the motions until it becomes obvious." Asking for excessive detail before committing reveals doubt disguised as diligence. "Can you send me all the documentation on this before I start?" Might sound thorough. It's often stalling. Someone who's bought in will ask clarifying questions, but then get moving. Someone who hasn't bought in will keep requesting more information, creating barriers to actually beginning. Redirecting responsibility is passive resistance masquerading as cooperation. "I'll need to check with my team about that" defers decision-making elsewhere. "Let me run this by a few people and get back to you" creates ambiguity about whether agreement will actually materialize. These aren't inherently problematic phrases. They become signals when used to avoid taking a clear position. Missing the follow-through after apparent agreement is the strongest signal of compliance without commitment. They said yes in the meeting. They never did what they agreed to do. When you follow up, they have excuses about why they haven't started yet. They didn't refuse outright. They just never intended to actually do it. The difference between processing and silent objecting appears in both timing and physical cues. Processing takes time, but you can see active thinking happening. Silent objecting involves shutting down while maintaining the appearance of consideration. Processing looks like visible cognitive work. The person's eyes might move up or to the side while they think. Their face stays engaged. They might make small movements, a slight lean forward, a head tilt, a hand gesture. You can almost see the mental wheels turning. This silence is productive. They're genuinely considering what you said. Silent objecting looks like emotional withdrawal. The face goes neutral or slightly hard. Eyes might stay on you, but without warmth. The body becomes still in that particular way that signals tension rather than thoughtfulness. They're not processing your idea. They're managing their reaction to it. Processing generates questions when the person finishes thinking. They come back engaged. "So if we go this route, how does that affect the budget?" Shows they were actually considering implementation. "Walk me through the logic there again" indicates they're trying to understand, not silently rejecting. Silent objecting generates non-answers when the silence breaks. "Okay" without elaboration. "Got it" without follow-up. "Sure" without questions. They're ending the topic, not exploring it. The brevity signals they've decided something. And what they've decided is that they disagree, but won't say so. Micro-expressions flash across faces during silent objecting. A brief tightening of the jaw. A quick downturn of the mouth corners. A momentary eye roll before the face settles into neutral attention. These flickers happen too fast for people to control, but slow enough for observers to catch. They're leakage of the real reaction. Breathing patterns differ between processing and objecting. Processing involves normal or slightly slower breathing. The person is calm while they think. Silent objecting often triggers shallow breathing or breath holding. The nervous system reacts to the internal conflict of disagreeing without expressing it. Creating safety for actual disagreement requires more than saying, "I want to hear your concerns." People have learned that leaders who claim to want honesty often punish it when they get it. You need to demonstrate through your behavior that disagreement won't carry consequences. Explicitly naming what you're seeing gives people permission to voice what they're holding back. "I'm sensing some hesitation here," opens the door without forcing anyone through it. "It feels like there might be some concerns that aren't being voiced," acknowledges the elephant without pointing fingers at specific people. Making it safe to disagree means separating the idea from your ego. "I could be completely wrong about this," signals that disagreeing with your idea isn't disagreeing with you as a person. "Help me see what I'm missing," positions objections as helpful rather than oppositional. Direct permission to disagree must be specific and credible. "Please tell me if you think this won't work," is clearer than vague invitations to share thoughts. "I need to know if you see problems with this approach," explicitly requests critical input. It's more helpful to hear objections now than to discover problems later, explains why honesty serves everyone. Protecting people who do voice disagreement reinforces that it's actually safe. When someone raises a concern, you thank them for it before responding to the content. "I appreciate you raising that," or "That's exactly the kind of thinking we need," validates the act of disagreeing separate from whether you agree with their specific point. Responding to disagreement without defensiveness proves that voicing concerns won't be punished. Your face stays open. Your tone stays curious rather than hostile. You ask follow-up questions to understand their objection fully rather than immediately countering it. Say more about why that concerns you invites elaboration. What would make that more workable from your perspective? Treats their concern as real and worth addressing. Admitting when disagreement reveals real problems shows that objections lead to better outcomes. "You're right. I hadn't thought through that aspect," demonstrates that people who speak up actually influence decisions. "That's a good catch. We need to adjust here," proves that disagreement improves rather than undermines the work. Sometimes you need to actively solicit the disagreement you sense is present. "I can tell this isn't sitting well. What specifically concerns you?" directly addresses what you're observing. "You got quiet when I mentioned the timeline. What's your take on it?" calls out the withdrawal and invites honest response. Asking, "What's the worst-case scenario if we do this?" gives people permission to voice their darkest predictions. Asking, "What am I not seeing here?" positions them as having valuable perspective you lack. Asking, "If you were in my position, what would worry you about this approach?" lets them voice concerns from a hypothetical stance that feels less risky. Normalizing disagreement makes it less socially fraught. These kinds of decisions always have trade-offs. What are the downsides you see? Frames objection as expected rather than unusual. "I'm sure there are holes in this thinking. Help me find them," treats critical input as necessary rather than optional. Private conversations sometimes surface disagreement that won't emerge publicly. "Can I get your honest take on this?" An aside conversation creates different dynamics than asking in a full team meeting. Some people need the safety of one-on-one interaction to voice concerns they won't raise in front of peers. Reading hedged language and passive resistance correctly lets you address objections before they become entrenched opposition. When you hear, "I think maybe we could potentially look at alternatives," you can respond to the underlying disagreement. "It sounds like you have concerns about this approach. What specifically worries you?" You're not pretending you heard full-throated agreement. You're responding to what was actually communicated underneath the hedging. When someone says, "I'll try," without conviction, you can surface the doubt. When you say you'll try, I'm hearing uncertainty about whether this is achievable. What would need to change to make this actually workable? You're addressing the compliance without commitment before work begins. When you see someone withdraw into silent objecting, you can name it and invite honest engagement. "You've gone quiet, and I'm reading that as concern about this direction. What's your actual take?" You're giving them explicit permission to voice what their body language is already broadcasting. Silent disagreement poisons implementation. People who never voiced their objections will say, "I told you this wouldn't work," when problems arise, even though they said no such thing. They'll feel vindicated rather than motivated to solve issues. They'll point to the failure as proof that disagreeing openly would have been futile anyway. Getting disagreement on the table changes the entire dynamic. When concerns are voiced, they can be addressed. When objections are explored, sometimes they reveal fatal flaws that save everyone time and resources. When doubt is spoken, it either gets resolved or the plan gets adjusted. Hidden disagreement helps no one. Surface disagreement makes everything better. Learning to spot unexpressed objection transforms your leadership communication. You stop being surprised when initiatives fail. You catch resistance early when it's still possible to address it. You build trust by proving that disagreement is truly welcome. You make better decisions because you're working with complete information instead of polite fiction. The skill compounds over time. The more you catch and welcome disagreement, the more people learn to voice it directly. The safer people feel objecting. The less you need to read subtle signals because concerns start being stated clearly. Your job gets easier. Decisions get better. Outcomes improve. Reading silent disagreement is the skill that makes itself obsolete through its own success. Chapter 5. What to do when silence follows your words. You just asked a critical question. The room goes quiet. 5 seconds pass. 10, 15. The silence feels thick and oppressive. Every instinct screams at you to fill it, to clarify, to rephrase, to say something, anything to make the terrible quiet stop. This is where most leaders fail. They break the silence prematurely because discomfort feels like a problem that needs solving. They speak when they should wait. They rescue people from productive struggle. They sabotage their own communication because they can't tolerate the space that's necessary for real thinking to happen. Silence is not the enemy of good communication. The wrong response to silence is when you reflexively fill every pause with more words. You train people that silence means you'll answer your own questions. When you rush to clarify before anyone has had time to process, you signal that thinking time is wasted time. When you break uncomfortable silence to ease tension, you demonstrate that comfort matters more than truth. Learning to work with silence instead of against it changes everything about your effectiveness as a communicator. Silence creates the conditions for honesty that constant talking prevents. Silence forces people to engage with hard questions they'd prefer to skip. Silence reveals information that rushed conversation conceals. But you need to know what kind of silence you're in and how to handle each type appropriately. Processing silence has a particular quality you can learn to recognize. People's faces stay engaged. Eyes might move up or to the side, indicating active thinking. Bodies remain oriented toward you even as minds work internally. You can almost see cognitive gears turning. This silence is productive. Real thinking is happening. Your job is to protect it. The physical markers of processing are visible if you're watching. Someone might lean back slightly, creating physical space that mirrors the mental space they're taking. They might tilt their head or shift their gaze away from you while their brain works through what you said. Breathing stays regular, maybe even deepens slightly. There's no visible tension in the jaw or shoulders. The person is present and engaged, just not verbally active. When you ask a complex question and processing silence follows, the best thing you can do is absolutely nothing. Wait. Keep your own body relaxed and open. Maintain a neutral, patient expression. Don't nod encouragingly or make little prompting gestures. Just exist calmly while the other person thinks. Processing silence can last 20 or 30 seconds, which feels eternal when you're the one waiting. Your discomfort with a pause is irrelevant. The other person needs this time. Breaking it prematurely interrupts valuable cognitive work and signals that you didn't actually want them to think, you just wanted them to respond. Watch for the moment processing ends. The person will usually make some small physical shift, a slight lean forward, Eye contact returning, mouth opening to speak. This physical shift happens a second or two before words come. When you see it, you know productive silence has done its job. Resistant silence feels completely different from processing silence. The energy in the room hardens. Bodies close off rather than staying open. Faces might go neutral or slightly cold. Eye contact either drops away or becomes hostile. Breathing gets shallow. Jaw muscles tighten. This silence isn't thinking. This silence is refusal. Resistant silence often follows questions people don't want to answer or statements they fundamentally disagree with. You ask, "What's your take on this new direction?" and get stony silence instead of thoughtful processing. You announce a policy change, and the room goes dead quiet in a way that feels hostile, rather than contemplative. The physical quality of resistant silence broadcasts its nature. Multiple people might cross their arms simultaneously. Bodies angle away from you. Someone might look down at the table or their hands with an expression of carefully controlled blankness. The silence doesn't feel like space for thinking. It feels like a wall. Resistant silence needs direct acknowledgement, not more waiting. I'm reading this silence as resistance. What's going on? Names what you're observing and invites honesty. This quiet tells me something about this announcement isn't landing well. Talk to me gives permission for objection. Waiting out resistant silence doesn't make it productive. People aren't using the time to think. They're using it to manage their reactions or wait for the uncomfortable moment to pass. The longer you wait, the more entrenched the resistance becomes. Breaking resistant silence requires you to lower the stakes. I can see this is not sitting well. You're not going to hurt my feelings by telling me why, addresses the tension directly while reducing the social risk of speaking up. This reaction tells me something important. Help me understand it frames their resistance as valuable information rather than problematic behavior. Sometimes resistant silence comes from a single person in a one-on-one conversation. They go quiet in response to something you said. And that quiet has sharp edges. "You just went silent on me. What are you thinking?" invites them to voice whatever they're holding back. That silence says more than words right now. What's the objection I'm hearing in it? Gives them an opening to disagree. Confused silence shows up in specific facial expressions and body language. Brows furrow, heads tilt. Eyes squint slightly or look unfocused. Someone might glance at others in the room to see if anyone else is following. Mouths might open slightly as if to speak, and then close again. This silence isn't processing or resistance. This silence is being lost. Confused silence follows explanations that didn't land, questions that weren't clear, or statements that assumed knowledge people don't have. You use jargon they don't know. You skipped logical steps they needed. You referenced context that isn't shared. They're quiet because they genuinely don't know how to respond to something they didn't understand. The mistake many leaders make with confused silence is asking, "Does that make sense?" after they've just confused people. This question puts social pressure on people to claim understanding they don't have. Saying, "No, that didn't make sense," requires admitting confusion in front of peers. Most people will nod rather than expose their lack of comprehension. Better approaches to confused silence involve taking responsibility, rather than putting it on the listener. "Let me say that differently" acknowledges your explanation didn't work without blaming them for not understanding. "I'm realizing I skipped some context. Here's what I should have explained first," owns the gap and fills it. You can also check for confusion without making people admit it directly. "What questions do you have about this?" assumes questions exist, rather than making understanding the default. "What part should I clarify?" presumes some part needs clarifying and invites them to point to it. Confused silence often includes people glancing at each other, trying to determine if they're the only one lost. When you see multiple people making eye contact with each other after your question or explanation, confusion is likely widespread. "I'm seeing some looks being exchanged. What did I not explain clearly enough?" addresses what you observed and invites clarification requests. Fear-based silence has its own distinctive quality. Bodies go very still in a different way than resistant stillness. This stillness is freeze response, not defiance. Faces might lose color slightly. Eyes widen or go very careful. Breathing becomes shallow and quiet. People are trying to make themselves small, hoping not to be called on or noticed. Fear-based silence happens when the stakes feel dangerously high. You've asked a question where the wrong answer could have serious consequences. You've created a dynamic where speaking up feels genuinely risky. You've established a pattern where honesty has been punished. People are silent because silence is the safest option. This type of silence often follows questions like, "Who's responsible for this mistake?" or "Why didn't anyone catch this problem?" The silence isn't people thinking about their answer. The silence is people desperately hoping someone else will speak first. Fear-based silence requires you to completely change the dynamic before useful conversation can happen. Waiting it out accomplishes nothing. Demanding answers makes it worse. You need to actively reduce the perceived threat before anyone will engage honestly. Naming the fear can help. I realize that question might feel like a trap. It's not. I'm trying to understand what happened, not assign blame, addresses the elephant, and attempts to lower the stakes. I can feel the tension in the room. What would make it safer to talk about this? Acknowledges the dynamic and invites input on changing it. Sometimes you need to answer your own question first to demonstrate that honesty is truly safe. I'll go first. Here's what I should have done differently in this situation. Shows vulnerability and models the kind of honest assessment you're asking for. Let me tell you where I made mistakes here, and then I want to hear your perspective leads with your own accountability. Fear-based silence in one-on-one conversations requires similar de-escalation. I'm sensing you're worried about how I'll react to whatever you're about to say. I need you to be straight with me, directly addresses the hesitation. There's no wrong answer here. I genuinely want to know what you think. Attempts to reduce performance anxiety around getting the right response. The instinct to fill silence comes from several sources. Silence feels like failure. You said something and got nothing back, which registers as your words not landing. Silence creates social awkwardness that cultural conditioning tells us to resolve quickly. Silence makes you feel exposed and uncertain about what's happening in other people's minds. Leaders often fill silence because they mistake it for incomprehension. Let me explain it another way. When what people actually need is time to think about the first explanation. More words pile on top of processing that hasn't finished yet. You're adding cognitive load when you should be protecting cognitive space. Filling silence trains people to wait for you to answer your own questions. You ask, "What do you think about this approach?" And after 3 seconds of silence, you start saying, "Well, the way I see it is." People learn that if they stay quiet long enough, you'll provide the answer, and they won't have to think or commit to a position. Rushing to fill silence undermines your authority and clarity. You make a definitive statement about a decision, and then immediately start hedging or over-explaining, because the silence that follows makes you nervous. We're moving forward with option B. Unless there are serious concerns. But this seems like the right direction, or at least I think it is based on. The silence after your initial clear statement was fine. Your inability to tolerate it created the mud. Silence holds power that speaking dissipates. When you ask a difficult question, and then wait through uncomfortable silence, you're demonstrating that you mean it. The discomfort is the point. The question requires real thought and honest answering. Your willingness to sit in discomfort proves you're serious about getting real responses. Strategic pauses create space for truth that constant talking prevents. You make a statement and then deliberately stop. You let the silence sit. People have time to absorb what you said and formulate genuine reactions rather than automatic responses. This project is over budget and behind schedule. Full stop. Wait. Let that land. See what comes back. The pause after bad news is particularly powerful. Rushing from, "here's the difficult situation," straight into, "and here's what we're doing about it," doesn't let people actually process the difficult situation. They need a moment to metabolize the news before they can engage with solutions. Pauses after questions yield better answers than questions followed immediately by additional context or hints. "What should our priority be here?" followed by 20 seconds of silence gets more thoughtful responses than, "What should our priority be here? I'm thinking it might be X, but I wanted to get your input before deciding." The added context tells people what answer you're looking for and destroys the value of the question. Knowing how long to wait requires calibration to the situation. Simple factual questions don't need long silences. "What time does the meeting start?" doesn't require 30 seconds of processing. Complex questions about strategy, priorities, or concerns merit substantial wait time. 3 to 5 seconds is usually enough for simple processing. Someone needs to gather their thoughts or choose their words. Brief silence lets them do that. Breaking in before 5 seconds have passed is almost always premature. 10 to 15 seconds works for moderate complexity. You've asked something that requires actual thinking. Maybe they need to recall specific information or consider multiple factors. 15 seconds of silence feels interminable when you're in it, but it's often necessary for quality responses. 20 to 30 seconds suits genuinely difficult questions. You've asked people to identify problems with a plan they helped create, or to voice concerns about a direction leadership seems committed to. This kind of question requires not just thinking, but internal negotiation about what's safe to say. The silence serves that necessary process. Beyond 30 seconds, you're usually dealing with resistant, confused, or fearful silence, rather than processing silence. Physical cues tell you which. If bodies are still open and faces engaged, people might need more time. If bodies have closed off or faces show confusion, waiting longer won't help. Your own comfort with silence matters, less than the productive purpose it serves. Feeling awkward during a long silence doesn't mean you should break it. Your discomfort is just discomfort. The other person's thinking is actual work that needs protecting. Silence after you speak serves different purposes than silence after you ask. When you make a statement and pause, you're letting it land. People need a moment to absorb what you said. The pause demonstrates confidence in your words. You're not rushing to justify or elaborate. You said what needed saying, and now you're letting it exist. Strategic silence after criticism or corrective information is particularly effective. This work doesn't meet our quality standards. Pause. Let that sink in. Don't immediately soften it or explain what you mean. The pause allows the reality to register before you move to problem solving. Silence after you ask something works differently. You're creating space for response. The pause signals that you actually want an answer. You're willing to wait because their input matters. Premature breaking of this silence communicates that you're not really interested in what they have to say. Breaking silence productively means knowing what to say when intervention is needed. Resistant silence might need acknowledgement. Confused silence needs clarification. Fear-based silence needs safety building. Processing silence needs protection, not interruption. When you break resistant silence, name what you're observing without judgment. This silence feels like disagreement. "Tell me what's not working about this plan," gives people language to engage. "I'm sensing pushback that's not being voiced. What am I missing?" invites objection explicitly. When you break confused silence, take responsibility and clarify. "That clearly didn't land. Let me back up," owns the communication failure. "I'm seeing confusion. Which part needs more explanation?" identifies where to focus without blaming them for not understanding. When you break fear-based silence, reduce stakes before requesting response. "I'm asking because I genuinely don't know, not because I'm testing you," lowers performance anxiety. The honest answer is more valuable than the answer you think I want to hear, gives permission for truth. When you break processing silence too early, you can acknowledge the interruption and create new space. Actually, take your time. I jumped in too quickly gives back the thinking space you prematurely ended. I'm going to stop talking now and actually wait for your response commits to the pause you should have given initially. Sometimes silence is the complete response. You make a statement or announcement. Silence follows. Nothing more needs to be said. The silence is receipt of information, not refusal to engage. Breaking it creates problems where none existed. Any questions? After every statement trains people to perform uncertainty, even when they understood perfectly. Trusting silence means trusting that people are capable of asking for what they need. If they're confused, they'll ask for clarification. If they have concerns, they'll voice them provided you've made it safe to do so and given them time. Your job isn't to prevent all silence. Your job is to create conditions where productive silence can do its work and unproductive silence can be accurately diagnosed and appropriately addressed. Silence becomes a tool rather than a problem when you understand its varieties and purposes. You learn to distinguish productive silence from problematic silence through physical observation. You develop the discipline to protect thinking space instead of filling it with nervous talking. You build comfort with discomfort that allows difficult conversations to reach necessary depth. Communication improves not because you get better at talking, but because you get better at strategic quiet. The words you don't say create space for the words that actually matter. Chapter 6. Adjusting your message while you're still talking. You're 3 minutes into your explanation when you notice eyes glazing over. You're halfway through announcing a decision when you see shoulders tensing and arms crossing. You're deep into the rationale for a new policy when you realize the confused faces in front of you have no idea what you're talking about. Most leaders keep going. They've committed to a message, and they push through to the end, even when it's obvious the communication is failing. They finish their full explanation while losing their audience sentence by sentence. They deliver all their prepared points while watching engagement evaporate. Then they wonder why their carefully planned message had zero impact. The ability to recognize failing communication in real time and adjust midstream separates competent leaders from exceptional ones. You don't need to nail every message perfectly on the first attempt. You need the observational skill to notice when your current approach isn't working and the tactical flexibility to change course without looking uncertain or incompetent. This isn't about hedging or backtracking. This is about reading room response accurately enough to catch the moment your message stops landing, diagnosing what's going wrong, and executing a clean pivot that salvages the communication. You're not undermining your authority. You're demonstrating the intelligence to adapt when adaptation serves your purpose better than persistence. Catching the failing moment requires constant reading while you speak. You can't get so absorbed in your own message that you stop watching how it's being received. Your attention needs to split between content delivery and audience observation. What are faces showing? What are bodies doing? How has the energy in the room shifted since you started talking? The signs that you're losing people appear in predictable patterns. Eyes that were focused on you start drifting. People who were leaning in slightly start leaning back or slouching. Faces that showed engagement go neutral or slightly glazed. You see micro-expressions of confusion, frustration, or boredom flash across faces before people gain conscious control. Physical withdrawal happens gradually and then suddenly. People shift their body orientation away from you. Someone picks up their phone. Multiple people start making small fidgeting movements, adjusting papers, clicking pens, checking watches. The room's collective energy shifts from attentive to restless. Vocal cues tell you when people mentally check out, even if you can't see their faces. Someone says, "uh-huh," in a flat tone when you pause. You get minimal verbal responses or sounds of acknowledgement. When you ask, "Does that make sense?" you get tepid nods instead of genuine engagement signals. The moment you notice these signs, you have a choice. Push through with your planned message and hope it somehow gets better, or acknowledge that your current approach isn't working and adjust it. Pushing through rarely works. The disconnect compounds. People get more lost or more resistant. Your message dies even as you keep delivering it. Diagnosing what's going wrong determines what kind of adjustment you need to make. The failure pattern tells you whether you're being too abstract, too detailed, using the wrong tone, or working from a fundamentally inaccurate read of the room. Too abstract shows up as confused faces and lack of engagement. You're speaking in concepts and principles, while people need concrete examples and specific applications. You're talking about strategic vision when they need to understand what this means for their actual work. Your language lives at 30,000 feet, while they need ground-level detail. People's eyes go slightly unfocused when communication is too abstract. They might nod along, but their faces don't show comprehension. They're tracking your words without extracting meaning from them. When you pause and ask if there are questions, you get silence not because everything is clear, but because they don't even know what to ask. Too detailed manifests as glazed eyes and physical restlessness. You're providing exhaustive explanation when people needed the executive summary. You're walking through every consideration and caveat when they wanted the conclusion. Your thoroughness isn't clarifying. It's burying your main point under mountains of supporting information. Watch for the moment people's attention visibly flags. You're explaining the fourth consideration in your decision-making process, and you see energy drop. They needed to know the decision, and maybe one key reason. Everything beyond that is cognitive overload they're not processing. Wrong tone creates resistance, you can see in body language. You're being enthusiastic about a change that's creating anxiety. You're staying neutral about something people are emotionally invested in. You're being diplomatic when they needed directness or direct when they needed diplomacy. The mismatch between your tone and the room's emotional state creates friction. Arms crossing simultaneously across multiple people signals tonal mismatch. Your chipper optimism about a difficult situation is landing as tone deaf, rather than encouraging. Your flat delivery of genuinely good news is making people wonder what's wrong. Tone that conflicts with content or context triggers defensive responses. Misreading the room entirely produces the fastest, most dramatic disengagement. You assumed enthusiasm when the room felt cautious. You treated a tense situation as relaxed. You spoke as if everyone was aligned when division was obvious to everyone except you. Your message was built on premises that don't match reality, so nothing you say can land correctly. Multiple people exchanging glances, while you talk signals fundamental disconnect. They're checking with each other to confirm that what you're saying doesn't match what they're experiencing. Your words describe a reality they don't recognize. The more you elaborate based on your inaccurate read, the worse the disconnect becomes. Executing mid-course corrections requires specific techniques that allow you to adjust without undermining yourself. You need language that pivots your approach while maintaining credibility. You're not admitting failure. You're demonstrating responsiveness. The self-interruption is the cleanest pivot technique. You deliberately stop yourself mid-sentence and explicitly change direction. Actually, let me approach this differently signals the shift without explaining why. Wait, I'm getting into the weeds here. Let me back up acknowledges you've gone too detailed and creates space to restart at the right altitude. Self-interruption works because it's decisive. You're not tentatively trailing off. You're making an active choice to change course. The confidence of the interruption maintains your authority, even as you abandon your current path. Let me say that differently is the most versatile rescue phrase. It applies to nearly any communication failure. Too abstract. Let me say that differently and follow with a concrete example. Too detailed. Let me say that differently and deliver the summary version. Wrong tone. Let me say that differently and match your delivery to the room's actual state. The phrase doesn't specify what was wrong with your initial approach, which protects you from having to explain your error. You're simply choosing a different method of communicating the same core message. The shift feels purposeful rather than fumbling. Here's what this means for you: rescues abstract communication by pivoting to concrete impact. You've been explaining the strategic rationale for a change, and you see glazed eyes. Here's what this means for you, followed by specific implications for their daily work, grounds the abstract in tangible reality. This phrase reorients the conversation around the listener, rather than the topic. People engage with information that affects them directly. When you pivot from general concepts to specific personal relevance, you recapture attention that wandered during the abstract portion. The short version is rescues explanations that have become too detailed. You're 5 minutes into comprehensive backstory, and you notice restlessness. The short version is lets you cut to the conclusion without having to finish the exhaustive explanation you started. This phrase acknowledges implicitly that a short version exists and should have been your starting point. You're course correcting in real time. People appreciate the pivot to brevity. Their body language often visibly relaxes when you signal you're about to get to the point. Actually, I'm noticing some tension here, names what you're observing when tone mismatch creates resistance. You've been approaching something lightly, and you see arms crossing and faces hardening. Calling out the tension directly addresses the elephant and gives you permission to shift your approach. This phrase demonstrates observational awareness. You're not oblivious to the room's response. You can see that your current approach isn't working. Naming the observation creates space to adjust your tone to match the actual emotional temperature. "Let me start over" is the nuclear option for fundamental misreads. You're 3 sentences in, and you realize your entire framing is wrong. Rather than trying to patch it midstream, you completely restart with a different approach. Starting over takes confidence. You're admitting your initial approach missed the mark. But the alternative, continuing down a failing path, wastes everyone's time and deepens the disconnect. Clean restarts work better than trying to redirect a fundamentally flawed beginning. Pivoting from abstract to concrete requires you to shift from concepts to examples, from principles to applications, from theory to practice. You're explaining a new process framework and seeing confusion. You pivot. Here's what this looks like in practice. When you get a request from a client, here's specifically what you'll do differently. The concrete example gives people something to grasp. They can visualize the actual behavior change, instead of trying to hold abstract process concepts in their minds. Their faces shift from confused to comprehending when you make the pivot successfully. Specific scenarios work better than general examples. Here's how this applies to the situation we dealt with last week. Connects new information to familiar context. Think about the challenge you had yesterday with a deadline conflict. This approach would change how you handle that, maps abstract guidance onto concrete memory. Pivoting from detailed to concise requires you to abandon the comprehensive explanation and deliver the stripped-down version. You recognize you're losing people in the details. You interrupt yourself. Here's what you need to know. The deadline is Friday. The scope includes X and Y but not Z. Questions about anything else? The concise version prioritizes essential information and trusts people to ask for elaboration if they need it. You're not withholding details. You're recognizing that loading all details upfront creates overwhelm rather than clarity. Headlines before details prevent this problem, but you can also pivot to headline mode midstream. Let me give you the 3 things that matter here, followed by 3 crisp statements beats, continuing with your meandering detailed explanation. Pivoting tone requires matching your emotional energy to the room's actual state. You're being upbeat about a change, and you notice resistance. You adjust. I'm realizing this news is landing differently than I expected. Tell me what's concerning you about this direction. The tonal shift from enthusiastic to serious and curious matches the room's guardedness. You're no longer pretending everything is great. You're acknowledging the disconnect and inviting honest engagement. Sometimes you need to pivot from serious to lighter, When you've misread anxiety as gravity, you're being somber about something people are actually energized about. I'm making this sound heavier than it needs to be. This is actually a positive development. Here's why I'm excited about it. The energy shift from weighty to optimistic realigns your delivery with a room's actual receptivity. You haven't changed your core message. You've changed your emotional framing to match what people can actually receive. Pivoting mode entirely means switching from direct to exploratory to diplomatic, or any other mode combination when your initial choice isn't serving the moment. You started with direct statements and you're creating resistance. You switch to exploratory mode. Let me stop telling you what I think and hear your perspective on this. The mode switch signals respect for their viewpoint and creates space for the honest input that your directness was shutting down. You're not abandoning your ultimate need to make a decision. You're gathering essential information before making it. Pivoting from exploratory to direct happens when questions are frustrating people who want clarity. You've been asking what people think, and you see impatience building. You switch. Here's what I'm deciding based on what I've heard. And you deliver a clear directive. The shift from questions to statements gives people the certainty they were wanting. Your exploratory phase served its purpose of gathering input. Now people need definitive direction, not more discussion. Recognizing when to abandon your planned message entirely and start fresh requires honest assessment of whether adjustment can salvage the communication or whether the foundational approach is unsalvageable. Sometimes you realize 3 sentences in that everything about your framing is wrong for this audience or this moment. Complete abandonment sounds like complete restart. Actually, I prepared the wrong message for this conversation. Let me start over with what you actually need to hear. The admission feels vulnerable, but it's better than spending 15 minutes delivering communication that can't work. You might realize mid-message that you're solving the wrong problem. You prepared an explanation of new procedures when what people needed was acknowledgement of how the changes affect them emotionally. Rather than finishing your procedural explanation and then addressing emotion as an afterthought, you abandon the procedure talk and lead with impact acknowledgement. Sometimes new information emerges during your message that changes everything about what you should say. Someone makes a comment that reveals a misunderstanding you didn't know existed. Rather than continuing with your planned message that won't address this misunderstanding, you pivot completely. That comment tells me we need to address something different than what I came here to discuss. The willingness to abandon your plan when the plan no longer serves the situation demonstrates strategic flexibility. You're not rigidly attached to your prepared message. You're committed to effective communication, and sometimes that means letting go of what you prepared. Physical signals tell you whether your adjustments are working. When you pivot from abstract to concrete, and you see people lean in slightly, the adjustment worked. When you pivot from detailed to concise, and you see visible relief in body language, you caught the problem in time. When you name tension and people's shoulders drop, you've created space for honest engagement. Failed adjustments produce continued or worsened disengagement. You tried pivoting to concrete, but you're still getting glazed eyes. Maybe you need to pivot to different content entirely, not just different altitude. You tried tonal adjustment, but resistance increased. Maybe the issue isn't tone, but fundamental disagreement with your message. Multiple failed adjustments signal you should stop and directly ask what's happening. I've tried a few different approaches here, and nothing seems to be landing. What's going on? Invites explicit information that your observational reading isn't capturing. Maintaining authority while adjusting requires confidence in your pivots. Tentative corrections undermine you. Maybe I should. Or actually, I don't know, let me try. Sounds uncertain and damages credibility. Clean, decisive pivots maintain authority. Let me take a different approach here, said with clear intent preserves your standing. The authority comes from your willingness to prioritize effectiveness over ego. You're not so attached to being right that you'll continue failing communication. You're responsive enough to notice when something isn't working and strategic enough to adjust course. This demonstrates strength, not weakness. Explaining your adjustments usually weakens them. I'm going to say this differently because I think maybe I was being too abstract, and you all look confused calls attention to the failure and makes people self-conscious about their confusion. Let me say this differently, makes the pivot without meta-commentary about why. The adjustment should be seamless enough that it feels like natural conversation flow, rather than acknowledged error correction. You're simply choosing a better path forward, not apologizing for taking the wrong path initially. Practicing real-time adjustment means building comfort with midstream course correction. Start in low-stakes situations. Catch yourself getting too detailed in casual conversation and practice cutting to the point. Notice when your tone mismatches someone's mood and practice adjusting it. Build the muscle of observing while speaking and pivoting when observation tells you to. Record yourself in meetings and watch for the moments when you should have adjusted, but didn't. You can see in retrospect where eyes glazed over, where bodies closed off, where confusion appeared. This builds pattern recognition for the signals that should trigger real-time pivots. Mental rehearsal helps. Before important communications, think through what you'll do if specific failure patterns appear. If I see confusion, I'll pivot to a concrete example. If I see resistance, I'll stop and invite objections. If I see boredom, I'll cut to my conclusion. Having these contingency plans ready makes real-time execution smoother. Some communications fail because the message itself is fundamentally wrong, not because the delivery needs adjustment. You're trying to convince people of something that doesn't make sense. No amount of tactical pivoting fixes this. The content is the problem. When tactical adjustments aren't working, you might need to abandon the message and gather more information before trying again. I'm realizing I don't have the full picture here. Let me hear your perspective before I continue shifts from broadcasting to listening. Reading the room during your own talking is harder than reading it before you speak, because you're managing multiple cognitive tasks simultaneously. You're tracking your content, monitoring their response, and maintaining your presence. This divided attention is why many leaders miss the signs that they're losing people. Developing this split attention takes practice, but pays enormous dividends. You become able to notice the moment glazed eyes appear and adjust before you've lost people entirely. You catch resistance early enough to address it before it hardens. You spot confusion soon enough to clarify before people give up trying to follow. The goal isn't perfect communication that never requires adjustment. The goal is responsive communication that adapts when the initial approach isn't working. You speak, you observe, you adjust. This creates a feedback loop that keeps your message connected to how it's being received. Your communication stays alive and responsive, rather than being a monologue delivered regardless of impact. When you learn to adjust while speaking, you transform from someone who delivers messages to someone who ensures messages actually land. The difference shows in outcomes, in engagement, and trust, and in your ability to create the understanding and action you need from every critical communication.